Welcome to The Debate. Today we are diving deep into one of the really foundational intellectual disagreements of the 20th century. We're looking at the tension that came out of that famous exchange between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky. And, this isn't just some abstract philosophical point. It genuinely shapes how we think about political critique and ultimately the pursuit of justice today.
It really gets to the heart of how we even start to think about changing society.
Exactly. So the core question we're tackling is this. Is laying out universal, sort of fixed standards like human nature or human reason, is that a necessary humanistic foundation for actually achieving a just society? Or conversely, is this whole universalizing impulse maybe an abstraction that hides the way power and knowledge really operate, in concrete historical ways?
Right. That's the crux of it.
So I'll be arguing from the position, broadly following Chomsky, that a relatively fixed human nature and reason itself are absolutely fundamental. They're prerequisites for any real scientific understanding and, maybe more importantly, for setting up universal moral standards that let us define and fight for justice.
And I'll be, coming at it from a different angle. Representing Foucault's perspective, I'm going to argue that these universal concepts like human nature, they aren't starting points for inquiry. They are themselves objects that need rigorous historical analysis. We really have to ask how they function, within specific social practices, within power relations. And we have to resist that temptation to search for these external, universal truths and instead focus on the actual, often messy, mechanisms of power and control.
Okay, so my core position, it really stems from the view that any true scientific understanding of the mind, and therefore our shared social reality, it's just impossible unless we posit some form of relatively fixed, perhaps biologically given human nature. This connects to the intellectual lineage of Cartesian rationality, which basically suggests the mind is governed by universal internal structures that are independent of, individual experience. The structural argument itself is, simple but quite powerful, I think. Look at the experiences any single individual has. They're partial, they're fragmented. How can we possibly explain our ability to deduce a unified experience from that? Or to communicate effectively, to create complex things, understand abstract ideas? How do we do that if not for some innate, biologically given, probably unchangeable governing principles? Chomsky argues this kind of biophysical structure underlies the mind, and it's the prerequisite for all our mental and, critically, our moral capacities. And politically, this fixed structure, it provides the indispensable standard we need. The task of intellectuals, then, is to use this innate reason and human nature, which Chomsky argues inherently seeks things like creative, meaningful work and free inquiry, use it as a universal standard against which we can judge the current social order. This lets us formulate a, hopefully, precise humanistic vision of a more just order. Without these fixed rational standards, we have no objective measure to define a better regime, and frankly, any revolutionary action just becomes a kind of roll of the dice.
I'm sorry, but I find that foundational impulse problematic. That whole approach, it seems to assume that the concept we're looking for, human nature, is some kind of unchanging truth just waiting out there to be discovered, rather than seeing it as, an historical tool that gets put to work in society. Foucault, he rejects the very notion of a fixed human nature as some kind of universal truth. He deliberately avoids the abstract, almost metaphysical question of whether it exists, and instead asks the critical question, how has the concept of human nature functioned in our society? And crucially, who benefits when we start talking about it? This methodological difference it's everything, really. For Foucault, the strategy is always to historicize these big universal categories whenever he encounters them. He demonstrates that concepts like life or human nature, they're basically broad conceptual markers. Their meaning and importance didn't come from some eternal truth, but actually from internal shifts within specific scientific disciplines or discourses. His focus is squarely on analyzing the social functions these concepts have played in practice. You see it in economics, in technology, in penal systems, everywhere.
Right.
So it follows then that Foucault explicitly rejects these grand utopian schemes, these abstract models of a perfectly just social order. His political imperative is different. It's the concrete analysis of power, asking how does power actually operate in our society? How does it create these intricate systems of subjection? Knowledge within this framework isn't separate from power. It's thoroughly enmeshed in it. So the pursuit of truth, what he calls the will to knowledge, it's necessary, yes, but not to establish universal standards. It's necessary specifically to unmask the real political and historical operations of institutions, how they shape us.
Okay, I see why you prioritize the methodology, the how. But let me push back a bit on the, let's say, the ultimate political efficacy of that historicist stance. If we reject universal standards, especially something like justice, derived from a potentially consistent human nature that values, say, freedom and creativity, then what guiding principle is left? How do we judge current injustices? My concern here, which echoes Chomsky's, is deeply political. We must fight political violence and injustice, but we have to do it in the name of something higher, some objective goal, namely justice. Think about it. If we enter a revolutionary situation, right, and we've thrown out all fixed standards for judging what constitutes a better society, aren't we running a huge risk? We could easily end up turning the new regime into something even worse than what it replaced. The core problem is about bringing about justice, and that seems to require those fixed standards, if only to justify fighting political violence in the first place. This idea of a fixed nature, it's the necessary tool, I think, for constructive, progressive critique.
That's a compelling point about political instability. I grant you that. But I'd argue that your proposed foundation, this universal biophysical human nature, it feels like a bit of a non sequitur when we're talking about political organization. I mean, okay, let's even concede for a moment that there might be innate biological structures governing, say, language acquisition. How does that specific empirical fact about biology actually help us draft laws, or design a fair wage system, or define a constitutional government? It really doesn't, does it? And furthermore, invoking justice as this higher goal, well, Foucault would say that's just using an idea that's been invented and put to work in different societies precisely as an instrument of a certain kind of political and economic power. He suggests the idea of justice itself should perhaps never be invoked directly in a political struggle, because it's just too easily co-opted by the very powers you might be fighting. His engagement is more like a combat or a battle. It's focused entirely on the concrete exercise of power and political violence as it manifests right here, right now. It's not about seeking these overarching, abstract principles of justice. We shouldn't ask what justice is. We should ask who benefits when the concept of justice gets invoked and used to measure people's behavior.
I'm still not convinced that fighting injustice must mean abandoning the language of, well, universal rights or reason. I think we actually need to reassert the value of the Enlightenment project, perhaps, and Cartesian reasoning. Reason is the reliable bedrock, or at least our best bet for a bedrock, for belief formation. And it's the essential tool for political action that aims at achieving real justice. The debate for me has to center on how reason and our understanding of human nature can be used to achieve greater justice. For instance, overcoming the alienation and sheer drudgery of so much labor, which, frankly, contemporary science and technology already give us the capacity to overcome. The fault isn't in the objective truth science might offer, it's in our oppressive social and political organization.
Well, I'd frame the issue quite differently, really by questioning this supposed neutrality of reason itself. You hold reason up as this sort of pristine tool for objective truth, right? But Foucault is intensely interested in the history of rationalization. He tries to resolve the issue of rationality not by finding its essence, but by examining its historical conditions, its political functions, its critical functions over time. I mean, look at Western culture. We've given this massive importance to the idea of the sacrifice of the subject of knowledge, this obligation to search for truth, the will to knowledge, as he puts it. Foucault argues that this very dedication to finding first principles, to building rational utopias, has actually left us totally in the dark, as he said, about the actual concrete functioning of power in our own societies. Let's take a concrete historical example. Think about how the category of madness shifted, right? For centuries, it was maybe a philosophical concept or a metaphysical one, but then as rational systems of classification and medical knowledge developed, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, madness became something else entirely. It became a disciplinary category, a medical one, a subject to be contained, diagnosed, corrected by these new institutions like asylums. So rationalization didn't just discover the truth of madness. You could argue it created a new way to categorize, define, and ultimately subject human beings. Foucault is fundamentally anti-metaphysical, anti-ontological here. He's analyzing the processes of rationalization itself, observing its function, not trying to find its universal ground.
That's an interesting point on the social construction of categories like that, I admit. But it does lead me back to my core concern about the scope, maybe, of your analysis. If you historicize everything and focus purely on specific local practices like Foucault's dividing practices or disciplinary technology, don't you risk reducing knowledge entirely to its social conditions? What happens to the conceptual independence of truth or the autonomy of scientific inquiry? It seems like it gets jettisoned if everything is just reduced to its political function. I mean, if knowledge is always just power, how can we trust any statement, including, arguably, Foucault's own critique?
Well, I don't think Foucault's aim is reduction in that sense. It's more about understanding the plurality of roles that something like reason, for example, has played as a social practice, quite independent of some overarching truth claim about human nature. He shows that concepts like human nature or life, they only really gain importance when internal changes within scientific or political disciplines cause them to be useful, to designate certain types of discourse or certain kinds of institutional intervention. His analysis really zeroes in on the material operation of power knowledge. Take the panopticon, for instance. When we talk about the panopticon, we're not just talking about that circular prison designed by Bentham, right? We're talking about a generalizable model of political technology, a technology of the body's function. It represents a whole set of techniques for subjecting individuals to discipline, controlling their time and space, largely by making them believe they might always be watched. And this model, this technique, it gets deployed everywhere, in schools, factories, hospitals. Okay, so Foucault isn't primarily concerned with the abstract, universal definition of the human who is being watched in the panopticon. He's concerned with the material function, the actual techniques used to define, classify, and constrain human behavior in everyday life. And that focus on material practice, I would argue, yields a far more incisive critique of how power actually operates than any abstract model of a just society derived from some fixed notion of nature. And that, brings us back maybe to the central weakness I see in a purely foundationalist approach. When Chomsky uses Cartesian principles to argue for this universal human nature that seeks creative work, he sets up, sure, a beautiful, rational blueprint. But by focusing only on the ideal blueprint, you risk missing the actual concrete cages that society is built to manage populations. That quest for universal truth often obscures or even justifies the historical and political practices through which we are defined, categorized, and subjected. These processes Foucault terms objectification and subjection. His goal is really to rigorously unmask how we are made subjects through classification and constraint, revealing the specific social and institutional relations of power at play.
And while I absolutely concede that historical analysis of the concrete operation of power, these technologies of the self, that it's incredibly valuable, we must understand the cages we live in, as you put it, I still maintain that analysis alone cannot replace the necessity of using universal standards, namely reason and something like a fixed human nature, to critically evaluate existing social regimes. If we completely jettison the concept of universal rights, perhaps derived from some fixed aspect of our nature, then we really have no inherent standard left to criticize even the most brutal regimes. How do we argue against them? We need these standards, it seems to me, to provide a coherent, ideally objective basis for any movement toward a more just future, and also to ensure that the political organization of our society actually satisfies what Chomsky sees as a universal human need, the need for creative work and free inquiry, which is for him the ultimate ethical and political goal.
So what this debate between Foucault and Chomsky ultimately reveals, I think, is just how profoundly difficult it is to separate political action from our underlying assumptions about knowledge, about truth, and about the human subject itself. They really offer two radically different paths toward critique.
Right. Foucault's method asks us to relentlessly analyze the systems of definition and constraint that historically, create who we are, how we understand ourselves.
Well, Chomsky's method requires us to find, or at least posit, some kind of universal, fixed blueprint for humanity, something that stands outside of history, almost, and against which we can measure all societies.
And the profound tension they leave us with is really this. Is our fight for justice ultimately about finding that universal, maybe unchangeable blueprint for human flourishing? Or is it perhaps solely about continually identifying and ripping apart the specific, historical cages we find ourselves confined within? That seems to be the enduring question.